Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Nathan and Susannah Furr, both of whom have co-authored this book called The Upside of Uncertainty. And I believe this is your first co-authored book, although you guys have been working together for a long time. Nathan, of course, is also the author of a number of books, including one I have right here called The Innovator's Method, but also Leading Transformation, Innovation Capital, and a bunch of others. And Nathan is an author, is a professor at INSEAD over in Fontainebleau. And Susannah is an art historian, designer, founder of a clothing line. And this new book, it does draw from both of your experiences. I think there's a lot of similarities that you draw between the challenges faced by business people and entrepreneurs and the challenges faced by creative types, designers, and folks in other industries. But it's really, I think it's a book that is unlike some of your other books, Nathan, which focus exclusively on kind of corporate strategy or how companies can be more innovative. And this really focuses on the person and the individual. And I've taught strategy for many years. I've found myself over the years increasingly thinking about how to take the insights around kind of corporate innovation and strategy and map them onto the individual. I was just in class yesterday and I said, every one of you is the CEO of your own life, right? Every one of you is the chief strategy officer of your own life. And there's these remarkable parallels when it comes to thinking about how to embrace uncertainty. So I was wondering if you could talk just a bit, did this kind of shift in terms of emphasis from thinking about kind of corporate strategy and innovation within companies to thinking about what it means to be an individual that embraces uncertainty? Is this a thought process that intentional? Was it really kind of brought on by the circumstances of your life, which you describe in the book? Or have you always kind of been thinking about these parallels?
It's a great question because I think going back into the history of the idea helps a little bit. So obviously it feels like we're in a period of great uncertainty right now, post-COVID, war, inflation, and all those kind of things. But it wasn't written as a pandemic book. That wasn't why we wrote it. Actually, it came about because in all these years of interviewing innovators, I noticed that we all admire the breakthroughs they create, the changes, the businesses, all those great things they create, but we almost never talk about the other side of that. And that is that to do all those things, they had to first step into the unknown. They had to face uncertainty. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not very good at that. I wasn't brought up that way. I wasn't given tools to do. I'm freaked out, and so I really wanted to know for myself, how do I do this? And so I would ask some questions all along the way, like, well, so how did you do this? And what did you do to feel more, have the courage to do this? And then it became more methodical over the years. And I went back to, research in fields like, ambiguity tolerance and uncertainty avoidance and resilience. And it was very clear that there were people who were better at this and that people did learn to be better at this. But for somebody who struggles, it just wasn't a good enough how. And so that's my side of why this is written to the individual, because in some secret way, I'm kind of writing it to myself in a way.
I loved the question. And I loved how you framed it. Like, was it a process or was it gradual or how did this happen? And I would say it truly has been Nathan's favorite question, since his Stanford days and he was getting so much great access to cool people that he could ask it to, and then he'd come home and tell me about it. And then I was doing my clothing line. We had 3 kids when we got to Stanford. A 4th arrived that first year, a little surprise. Everyone thought we were crazy. We lived kind of through uncertainty, but I always felt more comfortable with it. And so fast forward to the moment when Nathan was ready to finally write this up, I just loved the question and I felt excited about uncertainty. So I kept saying to him, like, ooh, do this or that, or I hope you'll talk to the human part. Because I think it would have, if I wouldn't have joined him, it would have been more like these books that you mentioned. He really wanted to create actually a corporate strategy for managers. And I said, but Nathan, and you know what? He listened to me finally when COVID hit, because it was that moment that he was freaking out with the situation we were in. And you know what? It was cool because, so it's not a pandemic book, but the pandemic shifted the book, because that was the moment when I just kind of said, I want to write this with you, but I want to write to the human inside the manager, because my belief is that uncertainty comes to us first in our body, in our own brain. And whether we were trained for it or not, if we can navigate it, a personal feeling, if we can navigate it in our own life, we will bring that. It will just come across into our work. And I think anything in life or career impacts the other. So uncertainty, wherever it shows up, is totally running havoc through our whole lives. There's no like talk about unsiloed. We don't have, we can try, but if something's impacting us in our life, it's going to impact our career. So we joined forces. We sometimes tell people our Native American totems are a snow goose and the woodpecker. I'm the one who likes to soar high and say, ooh, let's put this in the context of this bigger picture. And Nathan is so good at saying, yeah, but this is critical. And he woodpeckers the details into a framework that is maybe more easily understood.
Well, I mean, I think a big part of the book emphasizes that this is in many ways unnatural, right? Like we as human beings, we strive for certainty. I mean, uncertainty makes us anxious. You could have titled the book The Upside of Stress, the upside of anxiety, right? The upside of discomfort, right? Because all of those things are related. And one of the first courses I ever taught was on business history. And I taught it as like the constant struggle of corporate managers to impose some kind of order on the world, right? Like whether it was seeking out regulation, seeking out barriers to entry, doing everything they could to just buy a little peace of mind. And one of the exercises, one of the questions I ask my students on the first day of strategy is, and I don't know whether this is apocryphal or not, but I say, when Napoleon was looking for generals, he would interview his lieutenants and he would say, are you more comfortable in a world where you have these nice, neat decision trees with known probabilities and known payoffs? Or are you more comfortable in a world where the decision trees are like, it's actually a bowl of spaghetti, a bowl of eels swarming around it underneath some tomato sauce? And the class usually divides into those two different groups. And I say, hey, if you're more comfortable with decision trees, then fine, just be an operator, be a manager. But if you're more comfortable in the fog of war, then you're prepared to really be kind of an innovator or a leader. And yet that's sort of unnatural, right? I mean, are people born comfortable with uncertainty, or are they made?
So first I want to acknowledge your observation that it is unnatural. I mean, and why? Well, because we have, tens of thousands of years, maybe hundreds of thousands of years of evolution in an environment where the benefit of going, a little further from home wasn't very great compared to the risk. And so we were wired by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution to be afraid of uncertainty. But our context has fundamentally changed to an environment where there's actually immense safety. We're not going to get eaten. We're not going to starve to death. We're not going to get, lost. But the possibilities, the opportunities are very great. And so I think there's this fundamental shift in the context that's happened that our evolutionary wiring, we're kind of ill prepared for. But when you ask, is it developed? I have a co-author who's an applied neuroscientist, and he kind of summarized the agreement in the field of neuroscience about this question is that everything in life is a function of three things: genes, what you got when you were born, experience, what happened to you, and learning. So we have to acknowledge that some part of it, some of us were born with the natural advantage, and some of us had experiences that shaped what we could call our uncertainty ability. a big part of that, and that's what the research in uncertainty avoidance and ambiguity tolerance and so forth and resilience suggests, is there is a big part of this uncertainty ability, or the ability to face uncertainty with courage and resolve, that is learnable. And I'll just say, I believe that because I've lived it. Because here's the secret moment of the whole COVID pandemic, when we were working on this, and I was freaking out because, all of my income comes from teaching and speaking, and a full calendar like evaporated in 5 days.
The same thing happened to me.
Yeah. You know how this felt. It was gone, and we had just bought an apartment, and I have kids in university and all those things that so many of us have, those commitments that stress us out. And I was freaking out. And Susannah said to me, if you can't apply these tools to help yourself, I will not let you write this book. It will be too hypocritical. And so I had this long period of not only applying these tools, where we kind of learned to apply these tools to make changes, to say move to France, for example, or to make some other big changes in our life that we chose, what we could call planned uncertainty, but also to use it to respond to unplanned uncertainty, things that happen to me. And I can honestly say, I know that I have gotten better. And so I also know from personal experience, as somebody who struggles with it, yeah, you can get better.
Can I add something to what you addressed with your students when you give them that little Napoleon, whether it's apocryphal or not? It's a fun question, but what we hope our book does is encourage those people that love the decision tree to get just a little bit more curious and comfortable with the idea of whoa, what if I could just lasso a few more cool possibilities than I've been letting myself? Because the message is that all of us could have cooler and more brilliant lives if we just tried a little bit more, if we got a little bit more comfortable with uncertainty. So it's good to know yourself. It's good to know, I don't like risks. And we have a tool for that. Know what risks you have affinities and aversions for, but definitely don't just decide, nope, I don't do uncertainty, because you're missing out.
Yeah, you have a bunch of tools. Actually, the book has in every chapter a bunch of exercises that you can go through. And I really love that, because it's a very practical book. It's not simply an academic book where you kind of describe things, but it actually gives you a kind of a toolkit that you can embrace. And there's these 4 different sections in the book, and it parallels actually in the innovator's method, right? You have the 4 different steps. And the first one, of course, is the one that I really liked the most. I spent the most time thinking about, which is this reframing idea, right? Because there it's about you got to start with kind of a mindset shift, right? You've got to start with a way of kind of rethinking or recategorizing this uncertainty from something which is threatening into something which presents opportunities. And this kind of, a lot of this is sort of, I guess, related to the earlier work, which could be described as design thinking in a way, right? Do you see parallels there between the kind of stages or steps required to kind of embrace uncertainty, and kind of the stages and steps to become sort of an innovator in business?
Yeah, actually we do. And I will say, part of the reason why there's 4 categories of things to do is because, we found all these tools, and we're just but how do we organize that? You can't remember that many things. And what we observed is that they fell into these 4 categories. You mentioned the first. Reframe is about re-seeing the thing, not just in terms of the uncertainty, but in terms of the possibility. Number 2, how do you prime or prepare? You can do things in advance that can help you to meet that uncertainty with greater calm. And number 3, there's ways to take action that lead to a greater probability of a positive outcome. And number 4, you have to sustain yourself and your teams, because inevitably there will be setbacks and anxiety. We talked about that. Now, where does design thinking or lean startup or any, to be honest with you, a lot of those tools to me feed very heavily into the do. because how we take, and so taking action is one of the best ways to resolve uncertainty. But one of the best ways to take action is, lo and behold, to go back to what problem are we really solving, to run small experiments, to test and learn, to iterate and pivot. And we actually in that section draw very heavily on all the research that's come out recently on, for example, startup accelerators and how they help entrepreneurs learn really quickly, because all of those are like actually providing clues. Because what is an entrepreneur or an innovator essentially doing? They're essentially wrestling with there's some uncertain thing and there's some opportunity I imagine might be there. And it's all about resolving, figuring out where's the thing hidden under here, and uncertainty is kind of another way to say is the moat that protects an opportunity. And so how do I make my way through that?
One of the concepts I really liked is this idea of personal real options, right? So, of course, I've been teaching finance for a long time, and so I always talk about real options in the context of business. But this idea of personal real options and how do you build a portfolio? Because the insight in option pricing, and it's sort of there's a discontinuity in finance between kind of your basic finance and your kind of option finance, where in basic finance, volatility is bad, and then you flip a switch, and in option finance, it's like, oh, volatility is great. And so how should we think about building a portfolio of real options so that when uncertainty hits, it's like, great, fantastic, this is good for us?
Real options as an interesting idea, and I'll let Susannah answer, but I just want to say, we also use that in the strategy field. And what I feel like is when you move from finance to strategy, the concept gets a little more abstracted from kind of pure finance version. And the version we're talking about here is maybe even a little bit more abstracted from that. But that abstraction is really well illustrated. When you do research of different kinds, whether it's deductive or inductive or abductive, there's always this moment, this kind of aha moment where you see the pattern, right? Whether you see the pattern in the data or you see the pattern in the interviews. And for me, that moment was we were interviewing Ben Feringa, who won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2016. And he was talking, it was just like, science is all uncertainty. And I was like, so how do you navigate that? How do you teach students to navigate that fact? And he said, I always tell them that they need more than one leg to stand on. Because if you only have one leg to stand on, one project, and it's an uncertain one, you will kind of engage in all these things we know from behavioral economics, these traps of kind of, escalation of commitment, sunk cost fallacy, where you basically go down a bad path too far because everything's riding on it. So he says, I always tell them to have one project that is more certain and one that's more uncertain to get certainty out of the portfolio of uncertainties is what he said. And what in that moment, it like connected to all these threads of research, real options in finance, real options in strategy, and some very interesting research that's come out in the field of entrepreneurship that shows, for example, that hybrid entrepreneurs are more successful than entrepreneurs who go all in. And it's like, wait, the myth of Silicon Valley, or the maybe I shouldn't call myth, but the story, myth, good or bad, is that you got to sacrifice everything and dedicate everything to it. And there may come a moment when you do that. But before that, entrepreneurs who kind of have those two legs to stand on, maybe they're working their job, it gives them more time to figure out, is there really an opportunity here? Where is it? What does it look like? Without the pressure of, I can't pay my rent this month, so I have to quit and go get another job. So the research suggests those hybrid entrepreneurs are more successful. Now, once they figure out an opportunity, of course, they go maybe dedicate themselves full time. Mm-hmm. And so that was a really powerful idea. And then it connected with a personal story of one of our friends who, really kind of has created a really interesting life for himself, in a space where a lot of us wouldn't think. So what he's done is he teaches in the Midwest. He teaches English of all things. So it's not like the most high paid career, right? And yet he's managed to carve out a way to live part of the year in the French Riviera. And it's created so much conflict with his colleague whose dream it is to live in France. And he was trying to sort that out. And he tried to explain to his colleague, you don't understand. I didn't just get rich and go buy this. I've been working on this all along. I've been going summers, taking teenagers, not the funnest thing on these programs. And this is the thing I've been building all along. It's been what we could say is a personal real option. And what I've so appreciated about that conversation is the realization. So the advice of that section is one way to be calm under uncertainty is to have a portfolio of options rather than going all in on the uncertain thing. But the biggest thing that I hope people take away from that is that, in fact, the real danger is not that you're going to go all in on the uncertain thing. It's that you're probably going all in on the certain thing. And you're not bringing that thing you care about, that thing you dream about, into the portfolio of options in your life.
So in other words, it's about having a number of things going on at the same time, having your finger in a bunch of different pies, but prepared to kind of amplify your involvement should certain things occur, which would lead you to think that there's more possibility there, right? I mean, that's the way the option way of thinking is that you have a bunch of fingers in a bunch of pies, but you do have the capacity to plunk down more resources should you get good signals. I mean, Susannah, it sounds like you've had your finger in quite a few pies over the course of your life.
Yep. Yeah, we love to call them side projects, and I currently have several. And even just before this podcast, we've been on a book tour. We've been doing a lot of intense things. We have the opportunity next week to be in New York at Blue Hill Restaurant of Dan Barber and David Barber, who are doing amazing things to rethink agriculture and cuisine and changing the way we eat. But I was saying, Nathan, this is so intense. And he's like, yeah, but it's all cool side projects. And so reframing, even sometimes when there are so many pies, and realizing, yeah, this is great. Because sometimes there are so many pies that you're kind of like pivoting around, just going, wait, which one needs me, But it's really a reframe right there is to say, yeah, but this is dynamic and exciting. And, put one thing down and then turn and pick another thing up. And I guess I would just say it's definitely been a thrill to join Nathan on this book, because for me now, some other side projects I had kind of had to go on hold, but I'm really excited with where this is taking me. So it's very unknown. I did do a clothing line. We got to France. My whole life had to shift into expat setting up a world in France, which is hysterical, but then that kind of eased out, the paperwork and the format and how to pay for kids' lunches got figured out. It used to take a half of a day. So, just slowly working through things and yeah, being curious though and observant and not holding too tight to one project, I would say.
Well, you talk about this thing called, I don't know, was it the World Uncertainty Index or something? And I'd never heard about this before, but if there is there an objective way of measuring uncertainty? I mean, I also used the statistic that you cited in, I don't know, was it in this book or a previous book? The number of years that you can expect to stay on the S&P 500, right? I mean, we've seen that number go down consistently over the last century. I don't know if there is an objective measure of uncertainty, but a lot of people would argue that things are changing at a much more rapid clip now than they ever have been. And it seems like this creates quite a bit of anxiety, right? You use the term transilience, but people also talk about resilience. And what is it that people need to have in place? So is there anything they need prior to make sure that they're capable of dealing with this anxiety? You talk about uncertainty balancers, and I really like this term. It kind of reminded me of what Flaubert said. He said, I live a boring life so that I can be an artist, right? I mean, do we need to have, how do we set up sort of a foundation that is sufficiently solid so that we can embrace the uncertainty without it creating these levels of anxiety and stress, which paralyze you?
Yeah, absolutely. So we kind of like people to think about taking the thermometer, the temperature of their current uncertainty they face. And for some people, it might be so high that the thought of adding new possibility is actually not a good idea because there's just too much stress. And even if it's low and they want to add more, they should think about setting up what we call uncertainty balancers, because no matter what, this set of tools is really about making yourself feel more comfortable, creating islands of certainty. So what is one? And I guess Nathan loves to first say, sorry, we look at each other sometimes and say, you're doing it wrong. Nathan is clear to say that the fun part about interviewing all these people was they would just be ecstatic about uncertainty and claim that they eat it for breakfast, that they love it, that it's fuel. But as the questions would kind of dig deeper, there would be these revelations of, oh, well, yeah, I actually carry the same breakfast with me every day because I kind of need to know that I'm going to have that really healthy breakfast or whatever. Or, well, whenever I fly with the same airline. I actually try to sit in the same seat and I sleep at the same hotel and even the same room in the same hotel. So these really kind of rigid and certain choices. It could be an outfit that you always wear, like a Steve Jobs black turtleneck. All of these things are really meant to balance the amount of uncertainty you're dealing with. Because let's face it, there is a cap, there's a limit to what our brains and our hearts and our bodies can handle. And if you create some rituals and routines and comforts, then you bring down the temperature and you're able to do uncertainty that really matters. So
I think that Flaubert quote is perfect, though, because that's exactly the point. What these people do is they engage in creating these uncertainty balancers, which are habits, routines, rituals, outsourcing, simplification, relationships, communities, and even humor, so that they can engage in the uncertainty that matters to them. And so what Flaubert was saying is, the uncertainty that matters to me, that I want to take my limited human energy for, is being an artist. So I make the rest of it very, very boring.
Yeah. So in other words, it's not like something that is spread across your entire personality, right? So, oh, I'm an innovator, so I've got to get divorced every 2 years or something like that. It's like, no, actually, the steadier things are on one side of your life, kind of the more uncertainty you can embrace in other aspects of your life.
Yeah. So to that point, exactly. Sam Yegan, serial entrepreneur. He's known for like OkCupid, ShopRunner, all these things. He was CEO of Match.com when they self-disrupted with Tinder. He said, uncertainty's fuel for me. But when we dug into it, he kind of reflected and said, it's true. I did marry my high school sweetheart and all my friends are from junior high. And he literally said, given how much uncertainty I traffic in at work, I want like the rest of my life to be very stable. So, yeah.
Well, there's another thing I liked in the book is this 2x2 around kind of goal orientation and control orientation. I was wondering if you could dig into that a little bit, because it seems like you're advocating that people have this sort of internal goal orientation and this external control orientation. Could you kind of discuss that a little bit, how those things interact?
Yeah. So this is an idea that we heard among many of the innovators we interviewed, but also want to acknowledge has deep philosophical roots. So, and I think we're just pulling those threads together. But it's basically, and I also want to say nobody does this perfectly. So, but the basic idea is that there is a way we can approach uncertainty where we can have a lot of anxiety and fall into a lot of rumination, and a way we can approach it with less. And basically what we heard some of these innovators kind of say is there's two dimensions here. One is about the way you view your goals. Is your goal to become your best, to do your best, to contribute? Or is your goal to be the best, to be number one, to be the top player? And listen, innovators, of course, fall across the spectrum, but those who were calmer in the face of uncertainty were focused more on doing their best work, making a contribution, changing the world, because they didn't have to watch every kind of indicator of, am I number one or number five or number 500 and ruminate about it. All their energy went into I'm just making my best contribution. How do I do that? And then the other dimension of that 2x2 is, so I do something. Is the world in my control? Or is it actually partially not entirely in my control? And when you, and I think one kind of byproduct of the American can-do attitude is there was this kind of illusion that we control the world. And most people who have been through something hard recognize it's not totally in our control. We influence it, we nudge it, but a lot of things are outside our control. And so the people who are able to approach uncertainty with greater calm also kind of said, you know what? What's in my control, I'll focus on that. And what's outside of my control or partially outside of my control, I'm not going to obsess about that. And so there's this kind of golden space where you're focused on what are my internal goals, being the best, doing my best, making a contribution to the world. And I recognize that, there's some element of, in this complex, ambiguous world that I don't control. And so I'm just going to focus on the things I can control and let the other pieces go. That leads to a much calmer view of the world. And of course, if you're a big fan of Stoicism or you're a big fan of other philosophies, you recognize that right away. But these were often people who didn't know about that, who were saying this to us. And I think so we kind of wrote it up as having this uncertainty manifesto, which is, I've fallen into all four quadrants, totally be honest. But if you could say to yourself, the way I want to approach uncertainty is just focus on what do I control and what are my internal objectives? How do I be my best? And then recognize that the outcome isn't entirely up to me. You actually have a ton more courage going into the unknown because it's not so stressful.
Right. And so it's also a little bit less about what do I want and more about who do I want to be, right? And that is something that you do have a bit more control over than what you get out of the world. In the earlier book, Nathan, you talked about how business school, is all about teaching people how to manage mature businesses. And it doesn't do a very good job of teaching people how to manage sort of innovative businesses or startup businesses. And you called for the creation of an iSchool, right? And it's funny because this book, I was rereading it and I realized it's almost 10 years old now, but so much of it is still relevant. And I was wondering, should we rethink how we teach managers, engineers, lawyers, doers across the board? It seems like a lot of the skills that you're talking about in this book, The Upside of Uncertainty, we don't really teach them. We don't really teach them explicitly or implicitly. In order to prepare people for this world that is full of opportunity and uncertainty, do we need to rethink how we train people? You talk in the book, both of you talk about learned helplessness, but also, of course, learned optimism. How can we change our education so that people are capable of embracing uncertainty and profiting from it?
So you have put your finger on the thing that so excites me, that motivates me, that makes me curious. Every piece of work I've ever done is about this question of uncertainty, directly or indirectly, because I fundamentally believe there's this huge gap in the way in the tools we've developed in management, but also the tools in life for dealing with uncertainty. And that's really the upside of uncertainty is really about how do we what are the tools to face uncertainty as an individual? The innovator's method is about what are the tools to resolve the uncertainty of an idea. And it doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't we have these tools? I was just last week in the National Gallery in London at an exhibit of Winslow Homer, this great American artist. And I was standing in the gallery looking at this.
I went to that in September.
Oh, you did?
That's great.
Okay, yeah. So it's funny because it almost maybe took that outsider's perspective on an American artist to help me see what I took for granted, which was there's this beautiful painting of a veteran at the harvest, I think is what it's called. And what the exhibit tried to pull out was the immense uncertainty in this period of the Civil War when neighbor fought neighbor and the Reconstruction and how it didn't work that well. And this painting was painted right after Lincoln's assassinated. And it just emphasized this uncertainty. And I asked myself, why in the world, if we've always faced uncertainty, do we not already have an answer for this? And to be honest with you, I kind of think that, and this is just Nathan's underground thesis, that religion and routine and community, because we didn't travel so far. We worked locally. We were close at home. We had a routine. We had a community, and we had religion. These were tools that people had throughout the ages. And that has totally changed in the modern era. And if we think about the world wars, the existentialism and postmodernism and all, it's all about the angst of recognizing that we live in an uncertain world. But we don't have the tools. Now, there are people who are doing this. And this is, you mentioned the positive psychology work of Martin Seligman. You talked about, my advisor at Stanford, Kathy Eisenhart, would do this work on strategy and dynamic environments. I'm not saying we haven't developed pieces of it, but that full frontal, honest examination of we need tools for worlds of uncertainty. I feel like that's kind of like my life's mission, almost. And so I do believe we need to teach managers this. I do believe we need to develop an uncertainty ability. And part of why we ended up writing this book, in addition to individuals, is it starts at an individual level, but also because organizations haven't developed this. And you could say, oh, Nathan, why in the world we have not developed this in management? Well, the story I tell in the Innovators Method is because the problem that management was originally built to solve was a problem created in the Industrial Revolution, which was, before the Industrial Revolution, every business was a small business. You didn't need managers or management, but technology totally transformed that landscape into one of giant businesses. And now you need people who could organize and optimize and coordinate all this. You need managers, and business schools are created to solve that problem. And it's only recently, as the environment has indeed become more dynamic and uncertain, and technology has lowered the barriers to create, transact, and interact, that we've actually said, hey, wait a minute, what are the tools for this? And just look, you can see the symptoms. Like, entrepreneurship was not a topic in business schools until the last few decades. All our strategy frameworks were like strategies for a very certain world. It's only recently that we're really getting into dynamic strategies. I mean, we're developing these tools, but we're at the beginning of what I would call uncertainty science. And so, and I do believe that organizations need to train people for this uncertainty ability. I was with a very high up person in the fashion world, and he said, oh, LVMH, that's Louis Vuitton, Moet, Hennessy, the big luxury group that's always reinventing themselves, right? What's one of the 8 attributes they hire for? Well, the ability to navigate ambiguity and uncertainty. So it's not that organizations don't I think where we're at right now, the historical moment, is people are freaking out and feeling it and saying, where are the tools? And that's the job we have.
But do you think, you talk about sort of religion and culture and community. Some people would argue, well, those are things that prevent them from embracing uncertainty. Others would say that those create a foundation from which one can embrace uncertainty. Do you think that the lack of those things sort of strips away some of the resiliency that people need in order to tolerate the kind of uncertainty that we see? I always look back and when people talk about all the afflictions that we're encountering now, I'm like, well, COVID really doesn't have anything on the Black Death, or you're waiting in line at the airport. It really doesn't have much on the Holocaust, right? We've had to endure all sorts of things throughout history. Do you think that we are in a better place or a worse place when it comes to withstanding the uncertainty that we encounter?
I would kind of say both. So I would say there's a difference between a palliative and a tool. There's a difference between something that covers up or abates a problem and something that helps you do something. So my father recently had knee surgery, and a really bad knee. And he could take ibuprofen or a painkiller for a long time, and it would make him not feel the pain, but it wouldn't necessarily help him to walk. And so I kind of feel like it's good that we live in a different era, because we can kind of stop taking maybe painkillers that were covering up the problem and get to replacement knee, something that helps me do something, a tool that helps me do something. But at the same time, it's a hard period to live through, because we're developing those tools. We're developing the replacement knees. And so, some of what, sometimes we need palliatives, and that's okay. But I do think, so I would say I'm actually incredibly optimistic, because on the one hand, I see the angst that the lack of tools for uncertainty creates. And I think some of the modern kind of dilemmas we see are tied in part to our inability to navigate uncertainty. For example, our inability to hold two conversations between people who have really different views, or our inability to select the really challenging, uncertain hypothesis rather than the safe one that will get us tenure. I see it all over. I kind of see it as this foundational thing, but I'm also really optimistic because there are so many people working on this. And I really think we are getting better at this, and we do live in an environment of opportunity. And I kind of like, Susannah pointed me to this woman, Dr. Ayanna Johnson, who's a marine biologist. And I think she really captured the spirit of it well. She goes to these climate change forums, and appropriately people are warning of the dangers. But then she flips it and she asks this really beautiful question, which is, well, what would it look like if we got this right? And what that does for me when we talk about reframing is it doesn't only frame in terms of the uncertainty, it frames in terms of also the possibility. And so my hope is if we got better at using these uncertainty tools and at our uncertainty ability, and better at using the tools in our organizations, we actually could. What would it look like if we used those and we were able to get it right? That'd be really powerful, really empowering, really. I mean, that's my hope. So,
Yeah, I mean, you talk about activate and unlock as opposed to manage and control, right? So it's not about, I guess, dealing with uncertainty. It's actually about kind of creating it. I mean, endogenous uncertainty. So I think a lot of us think, oh, the world's changing, I got to deal with it. But I think you're saying that, hey, when you encounter something that seems certain, maybe go in there and break it up a little bit and stir the pot and kind of unlock a little bit of opportunity in that kind of stagnancy.
I'm glad you brought that up, because while you guys were kind of having a little moment, I was thinking the thing that Nathan wanted to first title the book was Managing Uncertainty. And I hated that title. And then it turned out that other entrepreneurs or innovators who he was interviewing saying, I love this topic, but I hate the word manage, because it's not about that. We can't. And, I think of MBAs, it's a school in managing stuff. And like Nathan said, it's coming out of the Industrial Revolution. We're in a totally different time. Activating and unlocking is really this beautiful idea that in any uncertainty or certainty, like you said, there's an essence in there that's waiting to be uncovered, there's an idea. Even if it's something we feel like we have an idea, it's a cool moment where a lot of people are coming up with the same ideas. What's that called? Creative synchronicity. Mm-hmm. How do we kind of honor the thing, even if it's driving us crazy, and just hold still and kind of start picking at it and like looking at it from different angles. And I think the question whether, religion or these cultural things are hindrances or not, I think it's going to vary for everybody, because Nathan and I were raised in a very traditional conservative religion. We lived it for many, many years. And over time, we're unwinding from it. But there was a moment of like, okay, we're not going to do this anymore. And that was a really hard moment for us. But actually, and ultimately, we feel so much more capable of doing uncertainty in ways that are fabulous. And we're getting to possibilities we couldn't have before because of kind of that framework that kept everything kind of locked and bolted in. And so, but for some people, it wouldn't, they need that to do their day. And we don't want to be critical of that. But I do think we have to, the paradox is that both things could be true, and it's going to be different for everybody.
Well, it's funny. Yesterday I was teaching my finance class at Stanford, and we got into a conversation. It's about the exam, and people, they were like worried about their performance on the exam. And I said, listen, you're not here to learn finance. You're here to learn, right, how to think and how to manage your time and how to take the big picture and how to process information. And so then they said, well, then why are you teaching us finance? Why don't we have classes in those things? And it made me realize, like, why don't we have classes in these things, right? I mean, why do we spend all our time learning finance and operations, and then we have to go to like a self-help book, right, to learn about things like uncertainty doulas and emotional hygiene and that sort of thing. I mean, is this something that we ought to be more explicit about when we're training people for the world? I mean, it used to be, I think, that the liberal arts kind of helped a lot in this regard, helped us to understand how to navigate life. And I think in a way people don't get that kind of education. But in the sciences and the professions, we don't really kind of teach people explicitly these tools for living. Um, at INSEAD, do you have a way of kind of teaching this content, or do you have to kind of smuggle it into your innovation class?
Yeah, I do sneak it in. And by the way, one of the major reasons why we wrote this book to the individual, and we wrote it with weaving in some personal stories, and wrote it in a vulnerable way, and said things that, like, I feel like I could be beheaded for in a school of management. I said the word magic in the book, which I quick.
Well, you do have tenure, let's just get that, get that out on the table. Right?
Yeah, but I do quickly qualify, by which I mean leaps of insight, serendipitous connections and things like that. But it was because we were actually working together on a book before this about how people define meaningful work. And it's a project that's still ongoing, and we'll complete it, but we kind of prioritize this project given all the craziness in the world. But it was hard for me to work on that project. We called it the Earnest Project. It was like, how do people define meaningful work? And for work for the sake of doing it well. And I really, really resisted this. And I have this, a friend that I talked to who's kind of like a life coach, and he just berated me. He just said, you academics are the worst, because you'll only talk about the most concrete black and white things when most of the world is made up of gray and ambiguous. Why don't you, for once, take the risk to apply your theories, your frameworks, your research capabilities, your analytical powers to these other things that matter so much? And that stuck with me really, really. And that kind of gave me the, and I'll just confess, was it so courageous? Not really, but it gave me the courage to go out and talk to very different kinds of people and talk to them about how do you define meaningful work? How does that change your life? And then that led to, in this project, a total shift from, I would have written another, I don't want to be, Susannah calls it the talking head book, where I say, well, Jeff Bezos does this, and so-and-so superstar does this, and you can be like them too. And in this book, we tried to be real. We tried to write it to our friends and say, like, you want possibility in your lives, but to do that, you have to face uncertainty. And by the way, you also have all had hard things happen to you. And so let us tell you what we've learned about how you can find if there is a possibility in that hard thing that is happening to you.
And so tell us about Dumbo feathers, because I've never heard this one before.
Okay. But do you know of Dumbo, the elephant in the movie? Yeah.
Vaguely. My Disneyology is a little weak.
Yeah. So Disney created a film, Dumbo, and it was about this sad little elephant who gets taken from his mother, and he has these really gigantic ears that are really weird and clumsy, and he trips all over them. But there's this moment when he realizes that actually with those ears, he can fly. But the only way he's able to do it, or what he believes, is this little kind of friend, sidekick bird gives him a feather and says, look, if you have this feather, then you'll be able to fly.
This magic feather. And of course, it's just an ordinary feather that he plucked out of his morning.
Yeah. And so Dumbo uses that feather, and the idea is that it's a prime tool. So it's one of these tools that helps you prepare for going into uncertainty. And we suggest readers find Dumbo feathers in your life. Create things. And, I say they can be people, places, or things. It's a noun. It's something that you hearken to, that you remember, that you believe in, that helps you go into the unknown with courage, with hope, with excitement even. And we share stories of people who, actually there's a beautiful magazine, a publication out of Melbourne that is titled Dumbo Feather. And it was started by a woman who was a consultant and was just feeling really disappointed with that kind of work. And anyway, she goes on to discover, you know what? There was not a publication she could find that would encourage her to be her best self. And so that was her moment. And she created that magazine, which now is meant to be a Dumbo feather for individuals who want to make change in the world. And they interview people that are working in regenerative leadership and change and beautiful things. And so our hope is that people, again, like uncertainty balancers, which is also a prime tool, we encourage people to seek out Dumbo feathers that they can rely on. It's a little bit different than the uncertainty balancer, which might be something you do every week or every day to help yourself. A Dumbo feather is a beautiful shining light in your life that you remember, and it feels almost like I wouldn't be doing this without that thing, even though you could.
Yeah, I could give an example of that, a concrete example. So when we got this an offer to move to France and join this business school, INSEAD, we had a great job in the U.S. I was at a university we liked. I was going to get tenure. Our kids had friends. Susannah's family her parents lived up the street. I mean, our oldest was 16, so in high school, the age you don't want to move them, and so it was really like it was a dream to join this great business school. It was a dream to live in France, but how in the world could I disrupt this very cozy situation? And I remember talking to my grandmother, and she said she was a real change agent in her life, a real provocateur, a really interesting character. And she just said to me, Nathan, parents teach their kids to live their dreams when the parents live their dreams. And for me, that was like this pivotal moment of recognition that I had to do it. And we could come back if it didn't work out, but I had to try. And that phrase helped me when things were rough. And there were many times when it's cold and wet and rainy and the kids are being bullied at school and your car's been stolen and everything's miserable. And, of course, that happened to a friend of mine, not to me. No, it happened to us, right? But that helps you remember, what are we doing here? And what is the goal? And that doesn't mean you can't change course, but that's an example of it. That was a Dumbo feather for me.
Well, you talk about values over goals, and I think that's sort of forced you to ask yourself really what your values were. You also don't reference narrow framing, but I think you make a lot of points along those lines, right? One of the exercises that I have my students do is make them think about how many choices they're making over the course of their life, how many risks they're taking, and then focus on the correlations, because I think they tend to think that every choice is fundamental and every choice is irreversible and every choice is going to have profound consequences, and they don't realize that they're going to be getting a stream of these choices, and if a couple of them go south, it's no big deal. But a lot of these tools that you mentioned are solitary, right? So whether it's Dumbo feathers or whether it is the reframing exercises, but you also emphasize how important it is that you have community, that you have social support, that you surround yourself by people who can help you to embrace and profit from uncertainty. Could you talk a little bit about that? I mean, how do we do that? How do we find that kind of support? How do we find that kind of community?
You made me think of two things. One is, I'll just say really quickly, we write this book to individuals, but I believe we can apply this in an organizational level as leaders to teams we lead, but also building this uncertainty building. So thinking of this translating this to organizational setting, I think is a real imperative. But while we were able to interview individuals who had navigated uncertainty well, there are very few, if any, organizations that have learned to train this well. So that's a challenge. So, but coming back more generally to community, it's very clear that community, it's one of the big uncertainty balancers. We interviewed, one of my favorite interviews was with a well-known actor, Dallas Roberts. And he said, for every job I get, I might have tried for 100 roles. And that's super painful, right? And how do you navigate that uncertainty? He talked about the importance of his community. And so I think recognizing how vital community is a great moment to assess and say, what communities am I a part of? and how are they helping me or hurting me? The other part of the Dumbo feather is what we call the quest destroyer. And I remember there was this hilarious moment where we're lucky enough to be on this safari, and our guide, who was was from that country and wanted to create his own guide company in the future. He just talked about how he said, you know what, if you want to be a pilot, you need to act like a pilot, dress like a pilot, talk to a pilot, and be careful of who you hang out with, because otherwise it will bring you down, down, down. He had this like really dramatic downward movement. It was so evocative, but of what we know, but we forget. And so I would say, what are you part of communities that are helping you or not? And I would say the one thing I could maybe add that isn't kind of common knowledge is you could creatively build your community. And I'll give you an example. I told you about that Earnest project we were doing. In a weird stealth way, all of those people we interviewed around the world who are doing meaningful work, they've become our community. And now we go back to people we interviewed and we'd like hang out with them and spend time with them, go to dinner with them. And we're rejuvenated by the integrity and earnestness with which they do their work in their lives. And so you might think about, for those who are listening who are saying, I don't have any, like, go talk to some people, go interview some people, go join some, construct your community. It can be a really rejuvenating thing.
I'd love to add to that. We live in France, and the French are kind of known for being private, and they're not like necessarily the friendliest people, and they really give you your, comfort zone. And in our old apartment, we knew no one in our building after 3 years. You'd say hello, but no one kind of went beyond that. And so we followed their lead, but in our building now, just somehow slowly over time, and it's definitely credited to these people who live here. They're wonderful, but it's a family. There's a mother who raised her 2 kids in this building, and now those 2 kids actually live in other apartments. So if this family have 3 apartments in our same wing, but we've kind of worked hard to become friends with them, and our girls babysit for them now, and we actually call them our French cousins. Then we've been calling them that for like over a year, and
secretly.
But this last week we had them to dinner.
Not so secret now.
Yeah, no. We actually told them last week at this dinner as they were leaving. I just kind of threw it out there because I know the feeling is mutual. We like each other. But they just looked at me and because I think for a French to be like us calling them our family, they said, well, good, because now we have American cousins. And it was so sweet. But I think actually people really do want to be close. I think under those French kind of snooty mannerisms, there's actually a lot of longing for just a friendly smile and a hello, and kind of even pushing beyond that. But community is huge. And actually, I would say, again, when we left our religion and that huge community, that was the hardest part. Because within our own family, there was even kind of some tension. And then with the greater friendship network, that was just something that felt kind of like going off a cliff. And I'll say we've had community exploits that didn't work out, where we tried and explored, and things that we were like, this is not our community. And so you kind of back up, and, you just have to not get discouraged when your efforts to find community don't really work out. Just keep trying, because you'll find some great people out there.
Well, I want to tie everything back together, the different themes, and ask about burnout. And there's all this talk now in the United States in particular about how people are getting burned out, they're dropping out of the workforce, they're experiencing great anxiety and depression and so forth. And how do companies create an environment where people feel safer experimenting, feel safer taking risks without having negative consequences, and without having this sense of abandonment and despair?
It ties into uncertainty, and it also ties into the story Susannah said about this restaurant this famous restaurant we're going to go film at, and this idea of what we could call regenerativity. And what the restaurant is doing, we actually were there as visiting researchers and kind of following everything they were doing to really reinvent the whole food system, not just to be sustainable, because sustainable is like par, and par is probably not enough. It's how do we regenerate the soil so it has more nutrients in it? I mean, if you eat an orange today, you actually need to eat ate oranges to get the same number of nutrients as you would have gotten, 50 years ago, because the soil's been stripped raw. And so they're asking, how do we regenerate the system? Well, we had just done this interview with this restaurant and observed the whole system. And a week later, I was interviewing the chief innovation officer at First American, the big title and escrow company, Paul Hurst. And he said, and they're going through a digital transformation. And he was saying, the quality or our ability to make a digital transformation depends on the quality of our people. And it was so directly correlating with the quality of the soil and this idea of regenerativity that it was impossible not to make the connection. And so for me, part of the burnout question comes back to, this an analogous way we've constructed modern organizations, like the way we've done farming, which is, pump it full of chemicals, strip the soil, get the most out. And the fact is, we're organic beings, and it's a system that can't go on forever. So part of this to me is, how do we design a system that is regenerative to people, so the quality of those people can be, that they're not getting burnt out, that they're feeling empowered, that they have the education and the tools and the ability to do all these things. And so that's a very multidimensional question. And I don't want to just narrow it down to like uncertainty ability is the only thing, but that's part of it. Building people's ability to face uncertainty, building leaders' ability so that they lead people through it in a way that isn't destructive. And then lastly, we talked about these uncertainty balancers. It's a really interesting dilemma, because sometimes we need the uncertainty balancers so we can tolerate the uncertainty, but sometimes we're getting burnt out because we're not doing the things that we're really good at, or we're maybe called to do. And so maybe we need to introduce some uncertainty into our lives. We need to do the personal real options and try to do something that really matters to us to rejuvenate us in another way. So I just want to acknowledge the multidimensional, complex nature of that burnout. But I think it comes down to regenerativity. I think it comes down to being able to tolerate risk, introducing uncertainty, stepping into the unknown to do the things we care about. I'd say it that way. But also, how do we lead people through unknown? I mean, I can't tell you how many leaders I saw in COVID-19 say things like, this is the worst thing since the Great Depression. This is the worst thing we've ever faced. And what happens? Everybody's freaking out, and their energy is getting sucked in anxiety and stress. And I like, compare that with, Airbnb. They lost 80% of their business in 8 weeks. If anybody has a reason to say, this is the worst thing that ever happened to us, it's them. And yet, Brian Chesky's response was, this is our moment. Great companies are forged in moments of crisis. This is where we show our character and our mettle. It doesn't mean that the crisis is gone. It doesn't mean they didn't have to lay people off, but it changed how they did it, and it changed how people felt as they did it. And so that's what I mean by that third part of, like, how do we lead people through it?
Well, I'm definitely going to steal that metaphor about the oranges. I love it. Right? It's kind of the Frederick Taylorization of agriculture and what it does to people in the workplace. Well, look, Nathan, Susannah, thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate it. And I hope to see you sometime in person sometime soon.
It'd be great. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much. What a fun conversation. Thank you for the questions.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.